Hi, my name's Phoebe Maltz-Bovy. I'm the author of The Perils of Privilege and a freelance writer, as well as a lecturer in French at the University of Toronto. Kat?
I'm Kat Rosenfield. I am a freelance pop culture writer for outlets including Vulture, Entertainment Weekly, Us Weekly, and I have recently written about the MeToo movement for Playboy.
Great. So I'm so glad we can chat, and I forgot to introduce my dog, who's apparently going to be joining us today. This is Bizou. She has many thoughts on all sorts of topics, as you can see. So let's first start talking about the Me Too movement, and specifically, were we going to talk about the Sherman Alexie installment of it?
Yeah, I think we were. The Sherman Alexie installment of the Me Too movement is an interesting kind of branch off of that tree.
Yeah, so do you want to introduce who he is and so forth? Thank you.
So Sherman Alexie is a writer from the Native American community. I think he is from the Seattle area. He's the author of an award-winning middle grade book called The Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian. And I think he also wrote a film called Smoke Signals. And he is also has the dubious distinction of being the most prominent man to get kind of thrown under the bus of the Me Too movement as it applies to the children's publishing sphere.
Okay.
And the big report on his bad behavior was released, I think it was last week, in a report from NPR.
Mm-hmm. And so what you noticed that was different about, and I'm just going to, oh boy, the headphones and dog situation may be a little complicated. But you had noticed that was different about this installment of this sort of ongoing story, news cycle, is that what Sherman Alexie specifically was accused of, as it were, what the incidents were, that this was not, at least from certainly from the NPR story that we were looking at, it doesn't seem as if this was anything criminal exactly. It was more just sort of being not a great guy at a sort of extreme level, but not violating consent, not assaulting, nothing of that nature, just being sort of not great.
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of what it's been interesting about the Me Too reckoning within children's publishing, which is that it's a very female-dominated industry to begin with, mostly women in power. And so the men who are being, called out in this case are really being accused not of having non-consensual relationships or extortive relationships the way we saw kind of in the entertainment industry, but rather basically of being cads. And Sherman Alexie is apparently, the biggest cad of them all in that he cheated on his wife a lot with, in this case, multiple women, but including much younger women who I guess sought him out for mentorship only to, find that he was more interested in pursuing them sexually.
Right. So what we were discussing on Twitter, as one does, is, I guess, just sort of what you do with this. What do we make of the fact that certain relationships that would have at one point in the past been considered, everybody's saying tisk tisk, then in the more recent past would have been consenting adults, it's fine. Now there's this kind of question mark, I think, with relationships that were like, say, a married man and a younger woman, consensual, but you think you froze on the Skype.
Oh, no. Can you hear me?
Oh yeah, sorry, you unfroze. Okay, great. Just I guess sort of what I've been thinking about is just what you do with that now, because it seems like there was a time when things like this could be sort of uniform. Everybody sort of unanimously would say it's terrible. Then there was a time when it was just consenting adults, unless you're sort of a Christian conservative or something like this. And now it's sort of this question mark where there's some people saying it's just wrong, others not. So what's your thought?
It's a difficult question. In the literary world, I feel like people cheating on their spouses is really nothing new, even dating back to a time when, maybe the norms were a little bit more, where everybody found it distasteful, for people to be non-monogamous. I think of specifically somebody like Anais Nin, who, was alive in a different era and who was not faithful to her husband, and who wrote, pretty honestly about that. And nobody seemed to really, frown upon her as a writer for behaving that way. But now what's kind of curious is not just that we're trying to hold men accountable in this sort of piecemeal way for having relationships that are distasteful or immoral. And I mean, I think it's worth kind of just making a sidebar here to mention that we have no idea what's going on in Sherman Alexie's marriage. It could be an open relationship. It hasn't been mentioned, which makes it extra complicated. But the idea seems to be emerging that men who misbehave in this way, who are bad husbands or bad boyfriends, should potentially be punished by losing their livelihood as a result. And it's, I don't know, I don't know how you kind of reckon with that, not just in a gendered way, where the question is, if we accept that women, need this kind of protection from men who behave like cads, that they need to see them punished. What does that mean for women's agency? But also, what does it mean to be an artist? And why do we expect artists to maintain this particular standard of behavior where we don't worry about it from the guy cooking our hamburgers or pumping our gas?
I wonder how much of this has to do with writing, and you would be able to ask about this for sure, writing aimed at children or young adults specifically, and how much, whether for novelists, say, who are not aiming for particularly a young audience, are they also, do you think, these days expected to sort of be faithful, find an age-appropriate spouse, not just a consenting adult one, and all of this?
Yeah, I don't know. That's a really complicated question, especially because so many YA authors at this point are also activists and are prominent in spheres that even, 20 years ago, it would have been, for instance, frowned upon to write a book that included teenagers having consensual sex with each other without one of them either getting pregnant or dying, kind of by way of punishment. There were sort of norms surrounding that. It was considered taboo to show an LGBT relationship, and parents would complain about that. And now it's really a badge of kind of honor to be a prominent progressive activist within the YA community, and to be flouting what 20 years ago were considered kind of like or at least the moral majority's morals. And there's a lot of debate now surrounding whether young adult fiction authors should be held to a higher standard, whether we, when we write books for teenagers, are we writing instructively, or are we trying to model certain behavior? But of course, authors are adults, they're entitled to have private lives. So,
yeah. I mean, I think that's interesting because these are really two different questions, right? What's in the works themselves and what's expected of the authors. And I guess my completely anecdotal sense of the literary world not aimed specifically at young people is that there is also a sort of activist bent, just that it feels that way on Twitter, but it could be that I'm just following certain people who give me that impression. So I don't really know.
I mean, the people who are on Twitter are also going to be the ones who are making that kind of noise.
Yeah.
But, when we talk about Twitter, what's interesting also is that a lot of young people are there and a lot of authors are there. And the line between author and reader, creator and consumer has gotten blurred in this way. And that's a whole other conversation, which I don't think we necessarily plan to have, which is, this sense of accessibility that people, especially teenagers, are experiencing now, where it's like, God, I can get on and I can tag my favorite author, and I can interact with them and I can talk to them. And there's at least the illusion of some kind of intimacy there, where I think that some people have developed an expectation that their authors are going to be in real life, the way they were expected to be, kind of from a distance.
Seems like a lot of pressure.
Yeah.
Just I wanted to get back to this question of relationships that aren't great, CADs, that sort of thing. Because there was a story from just before not really a story. So it's actually a call to the Savage Love cast from just before the Me Too moment that seems that I'm kind of obsessed with, and I wrote about on my blog at the time, or no, not at the time, after a few months. It just seemed to be like really emblematic of how things kind of used to be just before Me Too, and kind of gets at why I'm at least sort of ambivalent about sort of what comes next. And so it's not a long story, but it's just there's a cast of characters, I guess. So a guy called in, he was like 22, 23 years old, recent college graduate, to Dan Savage's podcast, the sex advice columnist and relationship advice, to say that a former professor of his, a man who was in his 50s or something like that, had just asked out a friend of his, a fellow recent college grad, a young woman, adult woman, not currently this man's student. And the reason the guy said he was calling in for advice, and maybe you'll have thoughts on this as an advice columnist as well, but the reason the guy says he's calling in for advice is that this professor had been his intellectual idol, and he can't believe that somebody he thought of as such a serious person would have done something as sort of crude as hit on a much younger woman. And Dan Savage was kind of like, well, the consenting adults, basically. This woman has graduated from college. She's not his student. Yes, there's an age gap. Yes, you have to take that into consideration. But basically, consenting adults, not your problem. You're not. And there was always this sort of subtext of, does the caller actually want to date his friend? Which it certainly seemed like between the lines, yes, I would think that caller maybe was interested in doing so. Because why else does he care? But at the same time, I remember hearing the call at the time and thinking, like, there's more to this than it's fine. It is fine, and it would be weird to say, and the caller is wrong to say that it's not fine. But at the same time, is everything that you can say about the situation that it's fine? Like, what if you want to say that situations like this are not fine, but it's not fine that things like this happen all the time? Or not that it's not fine, but something like that it's not the greatest. You know what I mean? Like, how do you talk about this? And I guess what I keep coming back to is that maybe just the answer is not to hold individual relationships or individual people to account in that way. Like the fact that a particular relationship isn't emblematic of what society, doesn't necessarily represent some sort of ideal society. It's still consenting adults. I don't know. That's where I'm
tough.
at.
I mean, that's tough because anytime that you're talking about relationship trends, you're also going to be by default talking about people. You're going to be talking about individuals. Somebody's
Right.
going to say, you are talking about my relationship. And this has been something that has come up for me a few times in the context of the Me Too conversation, because my husband and I were colleagues and we met at work, and very recently it's suddenly gone from being like it's a normal thing to meet your spouse at work to nobody should ever meet at work ever, and like it's disgusting, who would flirt with a colleague, what kind of freaks are you? And it's been interesting to see people kind of talk in this very broad way, like, this is something that no normal, reasonable, moral person should ever do. And they are talking in broad strokes. They're trying to say, like, this is generally not right as a trend, but they're also talking about individual people's relationships. And it's like, I don't know how you have that conversation, because it's sort of like trying to talk about a Seurat painting without talking about the dots,
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I think when you're talking about a situation like that with, this individual professor hitting on this individual, much younger woman, the way that is okay is if both of them are okay with it. I think you kind of have to approach each of them as individuals, rather as, check boxes of certain demographics. And that was sort of my question as you were telling the story was, was she into it? Like, did she say yes? Mm-hmm. Were they dating?
That was the question that was left open by the call, that I think at the time I think Dan Savage brought that up, that we don't know. We don't know what she thought about it all. And that there was just something kind of baffling about, there's these three men, there's the professor, we know a little bit about, there's the caller, there's Dan Savage, and then there's this woman, and she's just the complete question mark. Yeah, you have no idea what's going on with her.
And voiceless, and all these people talking about her. That's interesting.
But yeah, I guess what I thought there was that there just needed to be some sort of way of saying that these individuals are, if both interested, not doing anything wrong. At the same time, there is the thing that's wrong is what this sort of represents as an archetype. And it's just tough to talk about archetypes without sort of dragging individual couples into it. Because I think the problem is, maybe the problem's just that, 50-year-old female professors are not frequently, that there's no sort of equivalent opportunity for them to do this, maybe that would be, sorry?
So maybe that's the solution. We need to encourage it.
I don't think there's necessarily the same, it's hard to say. It could just be that there isn't really quite the same demand in either direction there, but who knows. But I guess what I think, though, also with this, and with what you're talking about how you met your husband, I met mine in grad school. I don't know if that's problematic yet, but...
Was he your professor?
No, and we're exactly the same age as each other, so I think not so problematic, but who knows. But he is a man, and that's, men.
That's a problem.
That is a problem. Well, it's okay. But just what I've been noticing lately, though, to do with MeToo and sort of like this, there's this kind of, I've seen a few different times cases of age gaps that are not particularly large being discussed as like devastating. Like, isn't it problematic that this person's like 3 years older or just things of that nature where both people are definitively adults. But the two sort of examples, so there are a few examples I have in mind of this, but one is not an age gap, but rather, so somebody pointed me to this on Twitter that I guess one person was taken to task for hitting on other people who had fewer Twitter followers than they did. Because that's a disparity.
A power differential?
Yes, which seemed to me curious. And I wonder if there's more to the story, because that seems strange. And then the other was just that there's been a lot of discussion, so to speak, online about, I've seen it on various social media, whatever, about David Brooks, the New York Times columnist, who has written about character and who has evidently, he divorced one woman and has married another woman. And the current wife was, I guess, his assistant of some sort and is a lot younger. And there's this sort of glee with which this is discussed on Twitter and stuff. And I just wonder how much of that is specific to people liking to bash New York Times columnists now, especially, or perceived hypocrisy in this specific case, and how much is that there's now this moment where something that in the past people would have felt a little bad about, like they're adults, you don't know what's really going on with them and so forth, that moment is sort of done, that you would hesitate in that way.
I wonder if that's, from your description, I'm not super familiar with Brooks, but it almost sounds like sort of a Twitterized version of the gleeful dunking on very conservative anti-LGBT politicians who get caught in a bathroom with, another man, kind of a thing where it's like, there is that perceived hypocrisy. And of course, it's interesting because that dynamic is very much in play in some of the recent Me Too moments where you've got a man who's a prominent feminist or self-declared feminist like Aziz Ansari, who's, proved to be kind of crappy in his personal life, doesn't always treat women respectfully in his personal life. And there's a similar kind of a glee in, unmasking that person as a hypocrite.
Mm-hmm. I think that makes sense, that the sort of the hypocrisy angle. I mean, I think there is some sort of human urge to condemn, and it has to find its way somehow. I mean, I think the danger is really just, I think that even though, I think there just needs to be a way of talking about things being bad, but not unacceptable, ruin somebody's life level bad. You know what I mean? I think the problem that I had seen before Me Too, and why I think Me Too has been helpful, not just in terms of talking about assault and harassment, but also just sort of more mundane interpersonal situations, is that I think there was a kind of sex positive moment that just preceded Me Too, where on the sort of progressive side of things, all that you could say was, well, they're consenting adults, let's not judge. And where the sort of broader social structures just wouldn't really come up, or would, but only get kind of like a nod. And I think there's some need to keep them in mind. And it also, when we're talking about specifically relationships between men and women, just, I do think there is some value in remembering that men and women don't sort of come to relationships from the same place in general, in terms of risk and so forth. But there just needs to be some way of talking about this that doesn't get rid of that initial, and I think correct, belief that there is such a thing as consensual, and that either something like, I think there just needs to be some understanding that the genuine gray area, not the actual assault referred to as such, but I mean like genuinely sort of not great situations, there just needs to be some sort of understanding that those are not the same thing as assault and harassment, if that makes sense.
Well, it's interesting because when you start talking about how women don't come to relationships the same way or expecting the same things, and we were talking about this a little bit on Twitter, but you start bumping up against, the idea that women are at greater risk when they come to a relationship, particularly a sexual relationship, is not a new idea. It's actually a really, really old idea.
But how do you get past the biology of it? I mean, one can get pregnant, one can't. One's more at risk of disease than the other. One could be assaulted more easily than the other, and so forth.
Right. Part of the sexual revolution and the advent of birth control obviously was, they happened side by side, and the idea was eliminating the risk of pregnancy. And at that point, I think STDs either weren't as rampant or as well understood. And when you say you mentioned that women are at greater risk of contracting something. That's true. I don't think that necessarily that's the most common knowledge. I'm
a child of the 90s, and I thought I was very, very scared of such things.
Yeah.
This has been somewhat, that mindset has been parodied on girls, I know. But.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, I didn't learn that, in my public school sex education classes, that women could contract STDs more easily than men. They were very focused on just keeping us from having sex, period. Yeah. But I would be interested to see if, you were to do a survey just of kind of the average pool of, say, 20-somethings. Do they all know that women are at greater risk biologically for contracting diseases because of biological factors? Right. But even so, the whole idea that women risk more because of pregnancy and so on, that obviously that dates back pretty far. And what's kind of been fascinating to me about how that applies to the Me Too movement is that where it used to be kind of a given that women risked more and they risked being degraded by sexual encounters. Now we're sort of talking about the same thing, only you're going to be damaged in a pathological kind of a sense. You're going to be traumatized. You're going to come away, having to process this thing that happened to you.
And even if it wasn't assault, or even if it was just sort of like the Aziz Ansari or cat person sort of realm.
Yeah. And, there's been a lot of debate about whether, for instance, the woman who told this story about Aziz Ansari was, whether it was reasonable for her to feel that way, whether after having an encounter with a pushy, not particularly respectful man, in which she was uninterested or unwilling, in asserting herself, whether she, should have felt traumatized after that. What's more sort of interesting to me is the question if we accept, okay, yes, she should have been traumatized because he did something objectively bad to her, and it was so objectively bad that he deserves the humiliation of having that incident splashed, like internationally across the media. If we accept that, yes, these things are true, how do you square that with the idea that women also have full agency and equality and responsibility in their relationships?
Well, I think with that, it is super tricky. I think, so there's a couple things. I'd say first that I think there needs to be a greater understanding that people react to the same situations differently. And that I think a lot of what the sort of initial conversations about Me Too seem to be this argument between some women saying one would be such and such situation is just inherently traumatic, and other women saying, no, it isn't, when it seems like the answer is for some certain situations are, for others they aren't. And I know that the woman who was assaulted by Roman Polanski when she was 13 has written about how sort of she's fine or something like that. So you never know. So, and that's extreme. That's pretty extreme. Mm-hmm. So I think there needs to be some sort of understanding that different people react to situations that do and don't cross various sort of objective like legal lines and such differently. In terms of how to square that with women having agency and so forth, I think it's the same as looking at any other situation in society where there are structural factors at work and individual will, and they're interacting in ways that are sort of hard to pick apart. I think there's what women are socially pressured to do in a situation like that Aziz Ansari date, and that it should be possible to talk about it, but that it should be possible to talk about it in a way where the answer could be something other than, yes, it was fine, no, he's evil. You know what I mean? Like, I think there needs to just be some sort of way of saying, this seems representative of a larger and not great situation, without sort of ramping it up to something beyond what it seemed to be from that admittedly strangely reported account.
Yeah. Well, it's the fact that account ended with the woman reporting it saying, that she had concluded after the fact that she had been assaulted, and that, this story was being framed as, very much part and parcel of the Me Too movement. And, I thought that it was interesting to see how a lot of people seem to kind of latch onto it as not about workplace harassment and earning kind of equal footing professionally, which is really where it started. And I think was, it was why it caught fire so quickly, that it was like a really recognizable framework to say, these are sexual situations, but they're affecting women professionally. They're preventing full participation in an equal playing field. But it was so powerful that there was this opportunity to be validated, that people started, they kind of wanted to be a part of it because of the validation, and not just to say, yes, this bad thing happened to you, and you have every right to feel, as terrible as you do, but the person who did this to you should be punished and humiliated and, deprived of things that matter to him. That seems to have been seductive in certain ways.
I think so. And I think in terms of what you talk about as a story being seductive, and yes, there is indeed somebody who had the audacity to walk through the hallway in this large apartment building that my dog thinks she owns. Yeah. I think there's something that I find curious about the way these stories, including the Aziz Ansari one, have played out, where the narrative that it sells, whether it's in a sort of progressive framework criticizing it or in a just sort of mainstream framework, older, more powerful man, younger, naive woman. This clearly sells as entertainment. And what I found so fascinating recently, there was an article in The Atlantic, I think, about middle-aged women who were preyed upon, like intelligent, professional middle-aged women who were preyed upon by some con man, basically on dating sites. And then they kind of get revenge. And what I thought was so interesting about this is here's a story that's they're in conversation, our dogs. No, but here's a story that's sort of about gender and dating and so forth that isn't sort of titillating in that way, that isn't aiming for that. Bisou, shh. That isn't, you know what I mean? That it just seems like there's something weird about the Me Too conversation where some of it does seem to be kind of serving as entertainment, even when it's presenting itself otherwise sometimes.
Yeah, I couldn't put it better. That's very true.
I mean, I've had this conversation possibly even on the other blogging heads, but I've certainly had it offline with people who, I think there's a sort of quiet understanding that that's some of what's going on, but it's like hard to say that as a take or a tweet or something because it seems like you're not taking it seriously. And I think the situations themselves are serious, but I think there's something about the way certain situations sort of catch on and others don't, all of which are serious, you know?
Yeah. Well, I mean, in any event, you know, you're still talking about people, even if they're not being traumatized in the sense of having lived through, you know, some horrific event, they're having their feelings hurt, or they're having their hearts broken. And that's obviously not.
Well, they lost a lot of money, basically, these women in the Atlantic story.
Oh, okay. I haven't read that one.
It's a heck of a story. Do you have other Me Too related thoughts, do you think?
Gosh, I mean, the one thing that I wanted to touch on and it kind of returns to the Sherman Alexie thing and the direction this is taken, is I think it's interesting how when this started out, it was sort of about imbalances of power and lack of consent. And now it's really moved on to, we've talked a lot about how women are treated within the framework of this conversation, but I think it's kind of important to talk a little bit about how men are treated, which is essentially that they've been seemingly handed this new set of rules where it's like, you have to ask for consent. But then when they do, that's seen as pressure. And the Sherman Alexie thing, you know, one of the examples given was that he asked a woman if he could kiss her, and she said no, and so he didn't.
That jumped out at me too. I was just looking at it, and oh my goodness, that was interesting.
But now he's being faulted for being asked. The idea is that he shouldn't have asked. It was a form of pressure, and you know, an unfair application of power for him to ask. I don't, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, from a pragmatic point of view, I'm not sure that this is a direction that's going to yield great results, you know, to basically say it's wrong for you to want what you want, or for you to ask for what you want. But I thought it was interesting to see that kind of so plainly stated.
Yeah, I mean, I thought that was interesting. I think that there are situations, certainly, where somebody is actually somebody else's boss, somebody else's teacher, and so forth, where asking would still be wrong. I think that's pretty clear that there would be situations where the ask itself would be inappropriate. This seemed, from what I could understand from that article, to be more borderline than that. It didn't seem a clear cut. It seemed more like he was being sleazy than that he was, you know, it wasn't his student or employee or something like this, right? Yeah,
more so not a manipulator, but a womanizer, I think.
Right. I mean, in terms of the question of where men, I mean, I think some of what, this was what I was getting at in our Twitter discussion about this, that about the purity and so forth. It doesn't seem like this conversation, not our conversation, I mean, the Me Too conversation has had a whole lot to say about the possibility of women ever asking for things or women wanting things other than women being okay with men wanting things or being less traumatized by men wanting things. And I think it just seems to be going in the direction of nobody should want anything and everybody should just kind of, like, yeah. And I guess I think what could have come of this conversation and the Me Too conversation, and maybe still will, would be just sort of an acknowledgement that most everybody wants something and that women have been held back from asking by social pressures and so forth, and to sort of fight back up against those social pressures rather than focusing solely on men asking for too much. Like there's also women asking for less than they would like to. And this sort of, yeah, and I think that would have been nice. And then I guess it seemed like things really weren't going in that direction when I just read this article in the Times that was about like what to do about women's, as this article presented it, very, very common desire to be dominated by men. And it seems sort of like, okay, I don't say that isn't common, but I'm saying that it seemed like there could be a much larger conversation about all the different things women might want, including not that just social pressure or just what's been even conceived of as possible has sort of been limited. And it seems like Me Too is just, it keeps the narrative the same. It's still the same narrative, but it's just a question of like who's in the wrong is shifting, kind of. Mm-hmm. I don't know.
Well, that was basically the end of my thoughts.
Yeah, I think, I just think people should have somehow, the end goal should be more options for everybody and also safety. I don't know how that's going to happen.
Yeah, but I know. I'd love to see, us get to a place where everybody is treated like a human being, and, maybe gender eventually does not play so much into it. In the meantime, and this is where, I come to it as, more from a kind of an advice columnist standpoint. I never want to see people encouraging women specifically to think that they can't cope with having their feelings hurt, or that, experiencing disrespect in the context of a sexual or romantic relationship is going to be ruinous for them.
Mm. Well, that makes sense. So I don't know if you wanted to talk about
skincare. I mean,
I don't know if we have as much to say about that, but I just found the debate fascinating, but I don't have very strong opinions about it.
Yeah, I mean, I was sort of more fascinated that everybody else had such strong opinions about it. It seems like such an easy point on which to let other people live. Yeah. And I mean, the only thing that really jumped out at me about the debate was, I think it was a line in the inciting piece itself.
Okay, so this is Kritika Varagor's outline piece about calling skincare a con.
Skincare con, yeah. And it didn't. I feel like there was a line. I should probably look it up. But it was something like, don't you have a friend who's obsessed with skincare whose skin isn't that great?
Yes, that's the line. That's the one I remember from it as well. Unfortunately, I feel like that line kind of. Okay, so maybe I do have strong opinions about this. So I think there is a feminist case for noticing that women and not men are spending a lot of money often on products that may or may not do anything and that you don't even necessarily see the results of and so forth. So it's not like self-expression in the same way as makeup maybe or something like that. You could, there's some sort of argument somewhere. But I feel like that piece, unfortunately, was just like, and you all are ugly too, and I think that line just didn't, well, I guess what it came down to for me, and like, I think this about a lot of things is like, rather than questioning the thing, it was this kind of brings us full circle actually. So rather than questioning the thing, it was about mocking the people who do the thing. Yes. Or calling out the people who do the thing. And it seems like whether we're talking about patterns of much older and more powerful men hitting on younger, naive women without sort of corresponding without that being a sort of gender neutral phenomenon, or spending a lot of money on skincare or any of these things. If you want to, you can question the thing, but like, don't say the people who do the thing are evil.
Yeah. I mean, I was having a conversation about this with a much younger friend of mine, who is like 23 and still really into skincare. And, you know, it was interesting to talk to her about it and realize how much, you know, for her and people of her cohort who don't need to worry about wrinkles yet, you know, but for them, it was kind of like a self-care thing. It was like a self-indulgent thing, you know, and it was feminist in the sense of like that kind of I choose my choice feminism, like I'm going to indulge myself. I'm going to do something that's just for me. And the fact that it doesn't necessarily have, you know, appreciable results, you know, that you can't really point to your cared for skin and say like, it's like this, but it would be so much worse if I didn't, you know, put snail mucus on my face. It makes it, I don't know, it's kind of interesting that like, it's like this purposeless thing, except for how it makes you feel like you're taking care of yourself.
I think that's super interesting. And that does make it different from, so I guess the reason I have not gotten into skincare is pretty much because I did get into hair care and I felt like I just had to pick, and there's only so much I want to or can spend on stuff like that. But with hair, I feel like what I do with my hair, it looks different if I don't. There's no question. But I think that is kind of interesting, this notion of just like taking care of yourself for its own sake and the results not being I mean, I have trouble believing that the results aren't on some level the point, and that some of this isn't a bit like with dieting where people will talk about like wellness and clean eating and so forth and say it's not about weight, it's not about weight, it's not about weight, but like on some level maybe.
Right. I mean, all of us are, you know, a lot of people, I'm actually a very active member of the fitness community, and, you know, it's just like an acknowledged thing that people come and say, my goals are primarily aesthetic. And everything else that you're doing and all the kind of sort of side benefits, like, you know, a low resting heart rate and better blood pressure and better skin, actually, you know, are all kind of, you know, they're tangential. It's like primarily want to look hot. But this also kind of brings us full circle, and we're talking about the framework that we all have to live in, and, you know, the kind of still gendered way in which women are judged, as long as the rules are that it's better to look younger, or it's better to, you know, have like nice plump cheeks or whatever. It's hard to fault women. Like, who wants to be the first person who doesn't play by that rule?
Exactly. I think that's absolutely right. And now I feel motivated to work out. My goodness. It's very cold out here. I'm in Toronto, where it's...
I was going to say, I'm in Connecticut, and it's not as cold here.
But yeah, I mean, I think that's really the issue with all of this, whether when you talk about something like women, whether it's skincare, anything like this, that is the situation, that is what's expected, and to fault individual women for living in that world seems, or to fault women generally for living in that world seems not so helpful.
Yeah, everybody's just doing the best they can.
That's absolutely right. Yeah. Any other thoughts on skincare / MeToo / the sound of a fluffy dog saying hello?
I'm just so excited that we managed to so neatly tie the skincare conversation into the Me Too conversation.
I did not think there was a chance. But everything's connected. Everything's connected. Any skincare products you want to recommend, or?
Oh gosh. Well, actually, the snail mucus thing.
Is it good? Somebody once tried to sell me this, and I was wary. What is the snail mucus?
You know, I don't know. It's called actually snail mucin, and I don't honestly know if they just call it that because it sounds better than mucus.
Okay.
But apparently it comes from snails, and I don't know what it does, but it feels nice and slimy, and, you know, it doesn't cost a lot of money, and when you put it on your face, you feel like you're doing something.
Well, that sounds fantastic. And I'm going to recommend a hair product, which I think is amazing, but is apparently expensive if you order it on Amazon from Canada, but not in the States, tsubaki oil. It's this Japanese oil. I think it's like from camellia plant or something. It's just a pure oil. You put it on your hair. This would be straw. Not that it isn't a little bit straw, but it would be complete straw if it were.
It looks lovely.
Well, thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, we both look fantastic and had a lot of great ideas. So everybody listen to us. Well, thank you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Yes. So I'm Phoebe Maltz-Bovy and
I'm Kat Rosenfield.
Okay. Right. Bye.